Well, good morning, class. So, I guess this will be the last day for this here segment. And I'll try and wrap it up around 1 o'clock, because some of you guys have early connections this morning. I had to get out of here. So we'll just go straight through, and then we'll meet again next October. And we may or may not be meeting in the current location, so we'll keep you posted. What we're going to do today is a couple of things. One, continue in our working together in terms of doing example charts, and within that we're going to bring in this idea of planetary nodes, what they are, how to use them. And within that, we'll save X amount of time for any review questions or anything you want to recover or re-ask and all that, review. So that's our happy sequence. Before we get going, is there any questions from the previous days that you want to cover with me? Anything you want to ask about at all?
I have one on when Pluto conjuncts the north node, and that rules out the south node.
It doesn't rule it out.
Okay, please explain.
It simply means that the soul's been already working in an area of evolutionary development prior to the current life, and that the entire chart, including the south node and its planetary ruler, all coming through it.
Okay.
It's like a siphon.
Drawing on that in their past life experience, the south node still represents that.
Yes, so there is essentially no polarity point. But that doesn't mean the south node's not in operation.
Okay.
It's just
Again, with Pluto and the nodes, if it's wider than 10 degrees and the south node is separating, would that indicate, is that too linear thinking, or would it indicate that?
Well, again, I mean, the essence of astrology is correlation and observation, and you know, so that the in quotes the rules relative to orbs are themselves in essence subjective. There is no objective meter in the sky saying 10 degrees for this and 5 degrees for that. But through collective observation via astrology over hundreds of years, that's where these orb designations have been coming from. But I know in my own observation, I've seen Pluto, say you take the idea of a conjunction, I've seen it work out to about 12 degrees. So that's just my own observation.
Yeah.
So I would just say go with what your sense of it is. Okay.
I think that you explained earlier if you look at my notes, the crosses, the meanings of the crosses, and I think that the one that you didn't touch on was the mutable cross. You said something about the fixed and something about cardinal but not mutable.
I don't even remember saying anything about the first two.
Wow, it was early, it was like first day.
I mean, we can.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, obviously, they're very dynamic aspect patterns. I mean, a cardinal cross, mutable cross, fixed cross, they have archetypical meanings. And obviously, from the point of view of evolutionary astrology, we always want to ask why relative to anything that we're observing. Why is this? And so then the question relative to why would be a typical reason, for a soul to choose in any given life to be born with a cardinal cross. Why would a soul choose to be born with a fixed cross, and so on? Why? What's the evolutionary intention? So that's going to always have to be the first question we answer, and we have to look into each individual horoscope to know it. But typically, with the cardinal cross in mind, these are people that are involving themselves, generally speaking, in a brand new evolutionary cycle in some way. The cardinal archetype is to initiate change. And change relative to what? That which has already come before, the past. So it's an entire archetype of initiation of change. One of the underlying problems in the cardinal archetype is even as it desires to want change or to initiate change, almost simultaneous to the change, it freaks out. And it becomes immediately insecure. So then here you have this, I want to initiate change, but then I get insecure by the very changes I'm initiating. And they want to then try to redouble back and re-secure the very thing that's just changed. So it creates that famous 2 steps forward, 1 step back routine. The net effect is change. But imagine if you were, closely linked with such a partner. And you've always got this 2 steps forward, 1 step back routine. That can be great fun. Yeah. Hi there.
Yeah.
You've been there, eh, Vernon?
Could you do fixed and mutable also?
Fixed is typically a scenario in evolutionary terms when the fixed archetype is emphasized that the soul is trying to establish and stabilize something. Establish and stabilize. It will typically come up when a soul has, in fact, initiated too much change in prior lifetimes to the point where the change has been so intense and significant there's no capacity to assimilate. It's like putting too much water in a cup. So the intention of the fixed archetype is to slow everything down. To fix it, root it, concentrate it, focus on it, stabilize it. That's why typically if you walk up to a fixed person and you say, well, let's go to a party tonight, the typical fixed instinctual response is no. They have to get used to something first. They have to warm up to it. Give them an hour and they might change their mind. And then relative to the mutable archetype is exactly why the human being is still on the planet. Because one of the archetypical manifestations that mutability correlates to is the capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. And unless you're able to adapt over great lengths of time, you're probably not going to survive. And that's one of the great features of the human organism. It has a tremendous genetic, evolutionary capacity to adapt to change. So mutability is an archetype of adaptability, but it's also an archetype, the impulse within it is ongoing and perpetual growth. Therefore, the mutability archetype is fundamentally restless. And that's why the great symbol for mutability is that, like you have that line and it comes back on itself, like a line that's going up, comes back, circles, comes back out, circles. And look what that means. You have change, assimilation, change, assimilation, but it's ongoing growth, mutability. Any other things you guys want to cover? He's ready for that doobie and nice music, huh? Okay.
Sometimes you put Hygeia in my chart.
No, Solar Fire puts it in your chart.
Solar fire. Do you work with it?
We've worked it to some extent. Hygeia, from what we've seen, relative to observation, has a lot to do with the nature of the physical body and what's going on purely on the physical plane of existence, but has a lot of correlation to the physical body.
The health of the physical body?
The health of the physical body. And where health can be improved. It's like I happen to have Hygeia and Aries, and throughout my life I've had adrenal system problems. Any other questions? Alrighty. Paul.
Chiron in evolutionary perspective, what is that?
Oh, that's a real big topic. It's Well, let's try to make it succinct. As an example, a lot of you have read in the Happy Books that somehow Chiron has an application to the wounded healer. And what this is referencing, i.e. wounded healer, is twofold. One, the healer does not know the intrinsic limits of itself. An example of that, a fairly recent prayer life I had, I was an actual priest in the Latin tradition. My job was an exorcist, and relative to not acknowledging limits, I was working with a specific person who was severely possessed, and in that particular life, my feeling was that God is just so darn all-powerful that as long as you're aligned with God, you can defeat anything. And my Chiron's in Scorpio on the 12th, so God could heal anything. What limit? And so I was working with this entity, and of course the evil spirit within it was so dominant that I ended up losing my life and being choked to death. And so that's an example of wounded healer not acknowledging limitation. And then also the wounded healer comes in through, especially for most of our degrees of evolution, when we're involved with healing other people, typically what occurs, unbeknownst to most people, a kind of an unconscious osmosis takes place where we're extracting into ourselves the symptoms of the other. So imagine extracting through osmosis symptoms of other into ourselves over great lengths of time. We're going to have a wound, all right, because beyond absorbing the physical aspect, we're absorbing karma. Wounded healer. Within this wounded healer in patriarchal times, to me there's a flavor of masochism in it, i.e. not knowing when to say no, / indiscriminate giving. Meaning that the healer in modern times is also, I've found a majority of true healers, I'm not talking about the one with stupid neon light crap problems. I'm talking about true healers, almost without fail are intrinsically masochistic. And part of that masochism is a spiritual masochism, which is intentional, no different than Christ hanging on the cross. But there's also seems to be in a vast majority of them also a very personal psychopathologic masochism that's in operation that's clearly self-destructive. And so we also have the wounded healer from this point of view. And so obviously one of the lessons of the wounded healer healing itself is knowing when to give and when not. As an example, not everybody that has physical problems or karmic problems is meant to be healed. Just to show you an example. And having to have the gumption or the inner knowing of who's who. And within that, a related issue, knowing how to help versus not, there's a lot of ways to help. So there has to be a discrimination at this level. But most importantly, in times that we live, for the wounded healer, Chiron, knowing how to receive. So all of this comes to the archetype in modern times of Chiron. That make sense? Because another thing too, I would say one more thing about the healer business. Some Chiron types want to, in a very kind of pure way, want to give and to help somebody when someone does not need to be helped, but they're sitting there persisting. That's also an application of Chiron. And that also means there has to be an adjustment to that. So another hand over here. Yeah.
It's in relation to that. The other day, you said that if Chiron was in opposition to Pluto, then you would look to the ruler of the sign on Chiron and focus consciousness there. what if the north node is conjunct Pluto? So Chiron is conjunct the south node. Would that change?
Well, the wound's going to be specific to the nature of that south node, the house and sign it's in, the location of its planetary ruler, for sure, and of course the related aspects. All that in total will comprise what the nature of that wound is. And by having it on the south node, it means you have anything on the south node is going to come into this one of three possibility things. Either completely reliving the wound, because there was no effort made in prior life to deal with it, or in fact the wound can be completely healed. But what that would then mean is that they're going to be attracting a bunch of people in this life that have that wound. And that what their task is to help such folks heal it, because it's already healed through inner knowledge within themselves. But the most common application is a combination of the two. So, all right. Good morning, class. Yes, ma'am.
Throughout the week, you've alluded to signs and associating it with different...
Speak up, please.
Throughout the week, you've alluded to signs that are associated with different historical periods. For example,
Yes.
I think yesterday you said Aries was associated with the Old Testament. Is that written anywhere, or is that just something we absorb through osmosis?
Well, sit down there and I'll go into this a little bit. Because we are going to be talking a little bit about planetary nodes. And I mean, first of all, I would say again that and to be very effective EA people, it's very, very important to have a very deep and comprehensive knowledge of history. It just comes with the turf. And I can't emphasize that enough. I've taught myself in this life history, and I have other ways of remembering, but I've learned to really appreciate history. I really have. And if you really embrace it, to me it is in fact the greatest teacher on earth that one could have. Because without a knowledge of history, you can't really carry forward lessons learned in any time to another time. That's one of the underlying problems with consensus state people. They can't separate from the time or place that they live. Unless you can do that, you can't carry a lesson forward. And that's why history keeps repeating itself. So first of all, really steep yourself in history. Every part of history, every region, every place, i.e. ancient Egypt, ancient Chaldea, the Persian history, the Tibetan history, the Mongolian history that everybody's forgotten. Nobody remembers anymore that. An example, the original Mongolian culture was one of the most evolved peoples that were ever on this planet, ever. And without remembering that, then we don't remember their cosmology. Their cosmology, seeing stupid patriarchal reality, everybody thinks, the postulation even through science is that life can't occur without the sun. And therefore you have the sun gods. And in a Mongolian cosmology, creation started in darkness. And God was the moon, not the sun. And in fact, that happens to be true. What happens when they finally develop the capacity to put these things way down in the ocean, next to volcanic vents? What did they find? Life. And if you just think it through logically, what happens when a baby's conceived? It's conceived in darkness and with warmth. So this is my point, is to really study history. And to know these different historical times, regions, people, the groups of people that have risen and fallen, and to really understand it. Without understanding it, we can't really apply correctly the astrological signs to the past. And yes, you can do happy little things like develop geodetic equivalents, or you can develop astrocartography and the like. And you can go ahead and project, astrological zones to fit the various longitude and latitude lines and all this and blah, blah, quack, quack. But within that is the knowledge of history. As an example, I can project through geodetic equivalence. We can look at the map and find Tibet. And yes, we now see that's on the cusp of Cancer, Gemini, relative to geodetic lines. But knowing the actual progressive history of Tibet, it's a Scorpio history. See? That's my point. So you have to know how to do that.
Can you get accurate enough study of history through a university?
Come on. That's all. That's pure
You
revisionism.
have to find teachers. How do you find people that would sources to teach you accurate history?
There's lots of different things you can do. Because not everything written historically is revisionism. About 50% is revisionism. But there are texts available that reflect, to the extent possible, accurate history. And one of my favorite things, long ago, I don't do it anymore, but I used to make a habit of prowling rare used bookstores. And as an example, just to show you a simple snapshot, one day I found a diary. It was an actual diary of a woman in 12th century, what we now call Britain. Her daily diary. Actual history. So there's all kinds of, there's things one can do, and there's, most importantly, knowing how to remember it within. We all have these cellular memories. And see, I'm sure some of you already know that one of the great secrets of the natural God, not the made-up God, but the natural one, is that whatever it is that you need to know, if you have a sincere enough desire, i.e. 100% sincere, and you put that question, whatever it is that you want to know, on the altar of your inner meditation, God has no choice but to respond. It's like when Yogananda decided to write the series of books called The Second Coming of Christ. And there's 7 volumes. And his intent was to be as faithful to the original words of Jesus as it could be. And so in that context, that desire, and he was praying to Jesus to be as accurate as it could be. And because of the sincerity of his desire, Jesus materialized for him, right in front of him, and simply said the following: "You and I drink from the same well." And he went forward and happily wrote the books. So it's a real secret of the natural God. And it's like all this Pluto business, these books. I didn't sit around thinking about in my head. It got nothing to do with my fucking stupid head. So it's like, really, literally. I mean, in fact, when all this occurred to me, I hadn't even thought about Pluto. Wasn't in my working vocabulary. And just never even considered it, because in your traditional books at the time, it was pretty much regulated to a couple sentences, generational application. That was it. And but also, the great joke in all this is, remember my fundamental hatred of astrology in the first place. I wanted nothing to do with it. So one day, you know, here I'm just being whatever I am, and this dream came. Dream. And in such a way that the entire first volume of Pluto was revealed to me in a dream as a book I was reading in Sanskrit. Not English, Sanskrit. And the whole book. So that's an example of see my point. So it's a combination of inner remembrance and a combination of finding legitimate materials to read. And more of the accurate history tends to come through female authors versus male authors. And there are some good books that detail prehistory, because what is prehistory? Before his story? Think about that, prehistory, before his story. Oh my. So of course the women need to write that stuff. Now, you know, like the authors I recommended yesterday, Monica Scholl, excellent material. And Eisler has good stuff. That one book called The Once and Future Goddess, it's a gold mine of accurate history. Gold mine. And yet one of the tragedies there is that, given, you know, what I remember of history, that a lot of what she's writing about is extremely accurate, and yet you can also feel her fear at times in terms of holding back the whole story of actual history, and her fear is based in men. So she alludes to things, but pretty much the story's there. And treatises like that, there's others. And so, any other questions? Okay. Now, one thing I would suggest you do as EA people is teach yourself, read the books written by Edward Jondro. He's the guy that innovated geodetic equivalence. Jondro, Johndro. And he wrote 2 volumes that detail his methodology. One book is called The Earth and the Heavens. And I forgot the title of the second one, but it's Jondro. This will detail his methodology called geodetic equivalence, which is different than astrocartography. In the years that I've worked with these systems, personally I've found that the geodetic system is much more accurate than astrocartography. So it's a way of fitting the celestial positions of planets to the terrestrial longitude and latitude lines. And his primary focus was in Earth events. He had nothing to do really with soul stuff. And he was an Aquarius, way ahead of his time. And he tested his system right and left, and to make sure it was workable and accurate. And as an example, he went to a place where on a longitude line and a latitude point would be the precise point that the transiting Venus was going to go retrograde, for example. And remembering that the nature of the projected creation is electrical and magnetic. And so he went to that precise spot. It was out in the ocean. And he had his little compass. And in that precise spot at that precise moment, when Venus went retrograde, the compass wobbled. And so he would do things like that. He was just this little funny Aquarian guy. Just make up all these Aquarian experiments. And he really worked with his system, you know, with these Earth events, and he really honed it down, and it works. That's the point, it works. And so in any case, the only struggle that finally occurred is that he didn't really know where to start the system. I mean, he started off starting at Greenwich, 0. And so because each zone has 30 degrees, so say from 0 Greenwich to 30 east, it would be from 1 degree Aries to 30 degree Aries. And you're all the way out to 30 east. And then from 30 east to 60 east, that's going to be Taurus. And it just come right around the globe. And so what he ended up struggling with was, because we're dealing with a tropical zodiac, and therefore the precession of the equinox, the moving point of Aries. And remembering that the two zodiacs basically are in harmony around 0, the sidereal, and there has been this precession. So he thought, well, that being the case, maybe I should start this thing at around 30 west because of precession. So then he spent X amount of years working with the system as if it started basically in Greenland. And so then he tried that for a period of time, and that's pretty much where everybody thought he left it off. But because I learned this stuff years ago, and I read his books and blah blah, and all I remember reading in the end of his material was, well, we're gonna start it here at 30 West. And so I started working with the system that way, and it wasn't working for me. And it always worked relative to Greenwich. And so then, long time ago, there was an astrologer named Charles, I can't remember his name anymore, but he was a really famous astrologer at one point. He's dead now, and Charles Jane. And he and I were buddies for a bit. And just before he died, I was on the phone with him, and he says, I want you to know something, because you're working with John Dro's systems, and because he was buddies with John Dro. You need to know that just before he died, he told me his system goes back to Greenwich. So, and that went like bingo for me, because, so I would say when you work with the system, revert it to Greenwich. So, and the system is very, very accurate, and it does cover most of history. So in terms of developing these zodiac zones, just remember that in each zone, i.e. from 0 Aries to 30 Aries, you're going to have the 4 natural cardinal points in each zone. So in the Aries zone, you have Libra, you have Cancer, you have Capricorn. Aries is the lead point, and vice versa all the way around. And like here, right here, we're on a Capricorn line. And through geodetic equivalence, in fact, it's Vernon's sun, right here. And then it meets up out here at 120 West to Sagittarius. And 120 West starts the Sagittarius journey. So, now look how that plays out in reality. I mean, when you live in the East Coast, what is the terminology? Out West. And out West is considered to be something still cowboy-like. But is it not generally true? People out West are much more natural than people on the Capricorn East Coast. See how it plays out? So, even remember when the first shuttle blew up in the sky? And that actually was an Aquarius zone. We actually tracked that explosion. And I forgot what the relevant transit was. There was I think it was when Uranus had just gone into Aquarius. And it was exactly on that longitude of the explosion. It was just incredible stuff. So in any case, you want to teach yourself to use geodetic equivalence. To start doing past life things. So when in terms of just trying to understand prior cultures, prior histories, and all this stuff. Now, especially when you start getting into the use of these planetary nodes. The planetary nodes have the same archetypical meanings that the south and north node of the moon does. We've all learned that the south node of the moon correlates what? With all the moon issues and archetypes that connect to the past. They bring it right up to the present, current position of the planet. And that's going to be the integration point. We have a trinity, past, south node of something, the current life, the natal something. And we have the evolution, the north node of the thing. So we always have this dynamic tension between the past and the future in each moment of our life. That dynamic tension is the south node, north node, relative to the current position of whatever. And that current whatever is the integration point of that past, future evolutionary impulse. So we can have some degree of integration and stability. Does this make sense? So, when you look into the planetary signatures of the planets, that's just what it means. You're going to have a south node function of Mars, for example. What have we learned about Mars? It's a reflection of the desires emanating from the soul, which instinctually get acted out. So, relative to the intentions of the soul. The Pluto itself is going to have a south node. And see, here's the magical thing to know about the times that we live. Everybody on the planet is going to have the same south nodes of Pluto, Saturn, Jupiter, and Uranus. And if you look at this and you bring it back through time, the south nodes of these things, Pluto, Saturn, etc., are in Capricorn. The north nodes are in Cancer. When you start doing past life stuff, and you now are linking it with ages and sub-ages, this directly correlates to the transition, i.e. the Cancer-Capricorn signature, for all of us here on this planet. Directly correlates with the transition from the matriarchy to the patriarchy. It's a direct correlation. This began roughly around 6500 BCE. And that's exactly where this sub-age of Capricorn relative to the Cancer age occurred. Right there. So now what is the meaning for every human person, soul, on this planet to have had some degree either direct prior lifetimes of that time, and what is the application to this time? Now, I mean, that's pretty dynamic stuff right there. Especially in which we're in a time in which clearly the patriarchy is out of control. You know, and it's also one of the reasons why, in the very context of the lives you've all lived, why increasingly women have begun to reassert their natural right. Yes, there's something more than Betty Crocker. And that somehow the purpose lies beyond changing the diaper. And you can see the underlying astrological reason why.
It seems like we're all on the planet also to heal the wounds from that shift so that we can bring it back into fruition, which is bringing it back into balance.
The key word is balance. I mean, see, very few, this is another neat thing to know is that, you know, because people can ask what was the actual circumstance that triggered the transition to the patriarchy. And historically, the answer is much more mundane than anybody really suspects. But one of the actual determinants, Capricorn, was a realization in man and woman that a man had an equal role in making baby. Up until then, shockingly, that knowledge did not exist. And our terminology now is thought to be a magical act linked with God. But once men gained that knowledge, that's what actually set in motion the patriarchy. Nuclear family never even existed until then. The issue of some parent wanting to know whose kid belonged to who, and all this. It all began at that time. In fact, women were given two choices progressively at that time. One, they could either legally declare themselves to be a prostitute, which meant that they had basically the same rights of men. They could educate themselves, they could own possessions, so forth. Or they could legally declare themselves to be, the language of the time, a good woman, which then meant to be essentially a possession of the man, limited to living in some hovel, typically not even allowed to go outside of the hovel. And basically all reduced to cooking for the man. Even when the man would have visitors, typically the woman is sent to the back room. And you can see those two choices coming through time. And that's why in the early 60s, when a lot of women began to rebel, and some of them wanted to, go into corporate life like the men were doing, and suddenly we heard the language, well, she's like a man, or she's a ball buster, and all this stuff. Remember all that crap?
What, it's different today, you think? I'm trying to see where that.
Maybe not as overt. A little bit more subtle, but it's still there, isn't it? Oh, well. So in any case, each function is going to have its own past, its own current moment, and its own future. And when you get really adept at past life stuff, understanding the past is always shaping the current moment, it provides a degree of information dynamics that just flush in the picture, so to speak. It's not, by the way, it's not necessary that you develop a permeating knowledge of the nodal axes of the planets to do effective EA work. It's just not. It's much more like icing on the cake. So for those that want to go that route, go for it. But believe me, it's not essential. We can do everything that a client would need to know, you can do without knowing the planetary nodes. That's what I'm trying to say. So, yes?
I was really out of it yesterday. I don't remember if we did this, but this is a good chart to ask my question on. His south node is in Virgo in the 11th house, but the 11th house has a ruler of Libra. Would you also, to fill in the information of that, would you also be looking to Libra? No, Libra.
11th house.
11th house is
Here? You talking about here?
Yeah, his south node is in Virgo in the 11th house. The ruler of the 11th house is Libra.
No, it's Virgo.
This is in Virgo, isn't it?
Mercury's
Libra's ruled
down
in
in
12th.
Aquarius.
Mercury.
Is in Aquarius in the 4th,
Right.
so it rules that house.
Oh,
and it
okay.
rules that
Oh,
belt.
okay. Sorry, I'm looking. Oh my God, I'm still
It's
doing
okay.
it.
Okay.
All right, then let me re-ask the question because it's not illustrated in that chart. If the south node is in, if the house of the south node is ruled by another sign than the south node is in, are you looking to the ruler of the
House
yes,
or
house
the
cut,
node.
yeah, also to fill in information on what's going on with the south node?
I just got horribly lost.
Let's take, for example, let's pretend that his south node is in Libra.
Okay, that's going to
Okay,
be Libra.
let's just pretend that it's in Libra. So if I'm looking at information on the south node, but that house is ruled by Virgo.
The south node's in Libra, but the house is ruled by Virgo, okay?
Right, would I be looking also at the ruler of Virgo to fill in information, like would I also look to the Mercury? No, okay.
And now, see, and this is another reason I pretty much hesitate to even teach this stuff in my schools, because this is the first time we've dealt with it in my schools. And the reason is that you have to have a comprehensive knowledge of the galactic ages, this what are called subcycles within primary age cycles. And then you have to have a knowledge of cycles within that. There's because any age is going to have a sub-age of 1,200 years, basically. Yes? But then you have to be able to break these things down into natural life cycles There's like subages within subages within subages, each one having dimensions, and to know exactly at what point in time you're orientated. That's where this system does not pick up.
I
So
wasn't
it's-
relating it to in the planetary node sense. I'm saying even if...
No, I'm just speaking in general.
Okay.
And this is actually a system I've been working on for over 30 years. And it's a system I call Journeys Through Time. And it's a way of actually being able to see in a very linear way. Let's say you started this thing at, say, 12,500, and bringing it all the way up through to the beginning of the Aquarian Age, which is 500 years from now. And you can break these things down into 1,200 year an age, a sub-age, age, sub-age. And within all of this, you have 84-year cycles. And each one is ruled by a sign, relative to the main sign ruling the age. And then there's a way to go into the birth chart, and this is now we're going to draw off a German system called cosmobiology, what they call cosmograms. And you can then develop a cosmogram relative to all this detail of where a planet and a sign will fit relative to the age. I mean, it's that detailed, so you can actually, it's like continuously focusing through a microscope. And you actually can then pinpoint, yes, 7,540 BC to 7,500, you see? And then link it with a latitude and a longitude line. I mean, that's how precise it got. And, but it's not, to me, the system still needs a lot of refinement, so I haven't published anything on it yet. But anyway, it's there somewhere. And so maybe when I get to be an old guy and I can't walk anymore, then I'll sit down and flesh out the details. But that's what I'm saying, we have to be kind of careful, you know. You have a question?
Your ages and sub-ages and measuring the night, it was in your packets I gave you.
Yeah, so you've got that part at least. The next part is the system to utilize to make it work. And this is certainly not the time to teach it. So, okay, what we're going to try and do is just start, we'll start with Greg and anything we're going to do with EA. So right away, why don't we just start with our basics, i.e. starting with the natal Pluto signature. We'll try to understand what this means. We'll then link it with the polarity point, and then move to our south node, planetary ruler, i.e. the past is bringing us to now, polarity point, the north node, planetary ruler, the aspects that are connecting everything. Let's just start right there. We're going to do it in a building block way. And we notice that Greg, relative to current life estimation, is a male. And he's first stage spiritual, and apparently in an attempt at religious conditioning. And of course, middle class. And so, who would like to make the first effort here? Let's focus our effort right here. Pluto Virgo in the number 11 house. What kind of desires would have preceded the current life? Bringing it right up to now.
It's a soul that's been desiring to find out what's unique and different about itself.
Clearly. Try to make our answers relative to the perceived evolutionary state.
So that feels a core alienation?
Clearly. What is the alienation based on?
Based on his awareness of, spiritual awareness that he has relative to the consensus and how everything is set up and structured, not supporting his core reality.
Yes. See, one of the dimensions of the 11th house I failed to mention the other day, it correlates to the entire discipline called astronomy and cosmobiology, astrophysics, and through extension, star systems. Now we started understanding certain souls that have an emphasized feeling of being different. I don't fit in here. For certain of these souls, it means because their origins come from different star systems. So anyway, let's continue on here. Is that going to be our limit to the understanding of Greg, that his core desire in prior life was simply to understand why he was different? Is that it?
I was kind of interested to notice this Uranus in Libra. Is that a new phase aspect to the Pluto in Virgo retrograde? Right across from that Chiron issue we were discussing earlier. Again, that's differentiation. You know, he's here to seek a new path, a new way, and it's tied to, it could be tied to, perhaps those times of Rome and in Rome when he was persecuted, perhaps for some astronomical belief.
Or maybe humiliated. There you go. In the group.
Well, I'm expecting a little bit more from you guys right now. Yes?
I'm sensing a soul that's desired to break free from a lot of the patriarchal or the religious conditioning, well, first state spiritual. I'm looking more towards the Virgo archetype as far as the sadomasochistic pathology, breaking free and shedding from maybe some of the conditioning factors that has come up through, you know, his past lives, with the emphasis of the oh, it's Mercury in the fourth house, okay. But a real separateness, a real sense of like alienation again. But I had a feeling more along the sadomasochistic pathologies, maybe breaking free from some of those is what I sensed with the Virgo archetype South Node.
Well, I'm gonna do everything that you guys are saying is correct, but see, this is what am I trying to say? That we also have to allow ourselves to be free from just a Virgo deductive quality of looking at anything, and we also have to have. Because in the end, the best healers, you can work with rocks and stones and heal. In other words, it's intuitive. And really, I'm going to say something about Greg at a soul level that you will see astrologically, but you would never see just looking at the chart. So the words are these. A soul that comes from a different star system, and because of it coming from a different star system, does not know where the fuck it is on a planet like this. And because of that, it has been looking for many, many, many centuries for its original tribe and or family, which it has had a core sense of identity with. And it's this very same relatively small group of people from the same star system who have come onto this here planet to effect some degree of knowledge that will have a transformative and improving effect on the entire biosphere and the social systems on it. This is the origin of the inner feeling of being deeply different and alienated within the soul structure of Greg. And because of this inner vibration, of being radically different, originating from a different star system. This is exactly why the lives on Earth have all been lives of intense persecution. Now, who can take it from there?
Well,
You can follow the symbolism, at least. You can see it, yes, when it's stated?
yes. The ruler of the 11th house is the Mercury and Uranus, and it's square Saturn and square the moon. And in the 1st and 7th house, and that, you know, I can feel that extreme alienation and that feeling of being stuck. But the polarity is Pisces, which is ruled by Neptune, and that has Venus in the north node and the sun. And is that the signature for this?
Good. Yes,
I
ma'am.
was going to say too, the 5th house with the Pisces and the moon and the north node and Venus.
Speak up, please.
Oh, it gives me the Pisces in the 5th house with the sun and the north node and Venus gives me the idea of this enormous need to fuse, like inner spiritual fusion, which 5th house is also about giving, so if he feels that inner spiritual fusion, it's going to be something that he's going to want to pass on. The 5th house is also the masses of people as opposed to the select and elite in the 11th house.
Right.
So he's coming down to spread his select elite knowledge as he bumps into people, as he's going around on the planet just by the very being of his nature.
There you go.
And looking for that place that fertile place to actualize, create creatively.
Right. Vernon?
Pluto on the 11th, will this tend to be what you're talking about as far as from different places, not of this star system? Is that going to be a typical signature?
It's not typical, no, because most souls on this earth originate from this system, whether you see 11th house signature or not. That's what I mean about going beyond astrology and being able to tune in your own psychic structure with the soul structure of the individual in front of you. Once you would tune in to a soul like Greg, I mean, it's sort of like the idea of, how many remember that kind of newfangled way of healing that came out of the 30s? You know, it's got all those dials and radionics.
Oh, radionics, yeah.
And so when you tune your own dial to the dial of Greg, you're getting a meter reading that says this all doesn't come from here. It just registers. Yes.
I guess I wanted to ask Greg a question too. Does he feel that he has to retune his dials as he meets different kinds of people so that he can tune into them because he's on sort of a different frequency, and so that's one of the things he has to learn?
There you have it.
Only here.
How about your daughter?
Not really, not my daughter, I think so, definitely.
Yes.
So there's a constant shock at the need to retune.
Yes. William, you had an observation?
Well,
No.
yes, I'm going to backtrack
Okay.
to EA 101.
Right.
Okay. We started off by saying that this is a soul that wants to see how it's unique and different. And there's a core alienation. I remember these words being used back a few days ago. My first take, it was very elemental. Pluto in Virgo, in the 11th house, I would have said that it is a soul that wanted to know itself through some form of service to a tribe or collective.
That's true.
That was the first.
That's true.
Yeah.
That means that's actually, again, the causative factor of why this small group that emanates from the star systems are on this planet. It connects now to exactly what you just said. But they have a very refined knowledge, a higher knowledge, that is going to be the connecting point behind the needing to be of service.
So that's several steps beyond, but it was just interesting that the core alienation came up And I don't get that, how that, yes, where we get the phrase core alienation.
By the sheer fact of the emphasized inner feeling of being different, I don't fit here. The extension of not fitting here is alienation, but it's also restated by his Neptune and Sagittarius, squaring the nodal axis.
Would it also be the Mercury in Aquarius?
Yes. Emphasized feeling of being different. So that the whole why structure of Pluto in this case is related to the origin of his soul. Why am I here? Why am I in this time-space reality? And once that question is ignited at his soul level relative to its origin, it starts to give rise to ideas, Virgo, of why it is here, which are all going to be linked with the underlying theme of service. Yes?
The other thing too about him being different, if you just look at the fact that he's a guy and he's got all this stuff in Pisces conjunct Venus and the sun, I mean his self is his sun, and it's not a very masculine signature, so just to have to deal with that in this culture and the 5th house, which is a very giving place, is wounding in itself.
Lots of water there.
Paul?
There's also a sense of, what I'm seeing in the Pisces in the 5th house is that he came to this planet with all this information in here. I mean, in the core of his being is all this information that he probably has not tapped into fully in past lives, or nearly, with the Neptune kind of squaring the nodes. There's this need for himself to go within and to follow his instincts through creative self-actualization, follow those creative impulses that he gets with the 5th house archetype. And as he follows those creative impulses, he will be led in a certain direction and tap into that inner knowing that he's come with, and then be able to disseminate that.
Outstanding. Excellent. See what's happening, see what you can do. Okay, is it that thing almost up? Or?
Yes, we better be done.
Okay, let's take our little break here. And see, one thing to, in a more generalized sense, to ask or to know, why is it that, there's two issues here. Why is it that, first, there is, because most of us know that there are other forms of life that impact on our Earth, what people call aliens. And the related question, why would souls from other star systems come here? And the answer is the same. That there is the nature of this atmosphere on our Earth, relative to the total manifestation in the physical plane, is relatively rare. The quality and nature of the atmosphere. And some of these, in quotes, aliens, in terms of their vehicles of travel, they need these sorts of atmospheres. That's something connected to recharging their fuel systems relative to the nature of these sort of atmospheres. So that they have an investment in sustaining the integrity of atmospheres on planets like these. Now, this is also then the causative factor of why they circulate, and it's a causative factor putting certain souls here that have, let's say, different knowledges than the human being has. See, this is one of the problems you will see in this sort of chart relative to this kind of soul. Start with your symbolism in the 11th house. Look where the location of the South Node ruler is, i.e. what sign. And what you have here relative to anger, i.e. that business in the 6th. What you have here is a deep inner frustration and anger, because you have a soul relative to its origin that had already, just by the nature of that type of entity there, that could literally create through ideational creation, and simply materialization relative to thinking. Now you put that sort of soul in this sort of structure, that ain't going to happen. And then it creates incredible anger, a frustration. Why can't I do the following? I have memories in which I used to be able to do this. Connect that, Craig? And this also translates into the basic anger at a perception of the stupidity as a generalized human being. But yeah, I just want you to understand how you see where these things come from. Vernon.
But that's still the basis of, if you want to say, this physicalness, because it comes from...
Physicalness?
I'm saying this particular space-time. In the sense of, it's coming out of, i.e. God / universe / the formless form, into something that is physical. Because as you were saying that, Jeffrey, I was thinking, okay, Jesus was able to do those things because he knew how to handle it. Or that classic line in science fiction, one man's science is another man's magic.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the underlying intent is the same, to help the reality here to evolve. Mm-hmm. And so then, that being the case, and we understand the origin of this sort of soul structure, and we have to start kind of approaching the chart a little bit different. You know what I mean? The underlying desire to be of service is the same. South Node and Virgo. And that, of course, is a very sincere desire. But relative to soul origin, what it's doing here in the first place, then we have to try to fit our answer relative to the desire to be of service. You see what I'm getting at? We have to fit it relative to the soul signature. So if we try to start looking at this chart from that point of view, would be the most logical avenues of service that Greg could assume to be of maximum benefit to the planet in the long run. Doesn't have to be the immediate, but the long run, as in seed planting.
Have more babies.
I can't do that by myself.
I actually got the idea from you in a last lecture where you were mentioning that that your quote-unquote aliens actually came down at a point of history that created Homo sapiens as we know today. Am I correct on that?
Absolutely. In fact, just as a kind of an amusing aside, they just because I've always said there's two different species here. You've heard that for a long time from me. And somebody finally did a little experiment between the Democratic brain and the Republican brain through brain imaging, and they just found that just structure different. That the Republican brain is actually structurally different than a Democratic brain. Two species. And it's unalterable. It's pre-programmed. Which means that this... Huh? I'm sorry?
What's the percentage? Is it like...
It's about 50-50. Or let's say 51-49?
You mentioned the time when that started, the differentiation of Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember what that.
It connects directly to when there was a leap in the evolutionary capacity of the brain and the development of the ongoing human being. There's a gap between what was called the Homo erectus and the Homo sapien. There's a gap there. They can't go back in time and find where the bridge is. There's just suddenly a leap. from brain capacity from the Homo erectus to the Homo sapien. There's a gap. And it's in exactly that time that this interfacing / impregnation occurred.
Thank you.
Let's get back to more mundane things. So, yes.
Is it possible that there's a level of shock within his system that when he came here in past lives and he was developing advanced systems and putting them out, coming from his understanding of the interconnectedness of everything from his own origins, that I get the feeling that he got shocked by, specifically from people stealing his systems and competition, by seeing that level of, what's the word I'm looking for, certain intentions that are here that are alien to him, and that not only just persecution, but it's like the level of shock of competition and having people had stolen his systems and things like that.
The misuse of knowledge, the misuse of systems. That's quite accurate. That's part of what the ongoing rage is about. Christian?
He's been talking a lot about trying to figure out what his life purpose is, his fifth house. I mean, obviously, it's got to be something around healing from my perspective, but some kind of energetic balancing. We've got all the Aquarian energy in this chart. He can use his mind, he can use his hands. He's got Mercury in Aquarius, which is the ruler of the South Node and Pluto. And with Venus on his North Node, there's obviously an imbalance here, but he may have the ability to pick up that in others, and I don't know if that would be a Reiki thing or there's something about using his mind and his hands to create more balance on the planet. I know emotional could play a role, family issue that came up for him because his Mercury's in the 4th house. Mercury in the 4th house.
You're correct in all those accounts. The really what you have here is a, how would you say, from the highest capacity stepping down to different functions that are still linked with service to the whole. The very highest capacity, if you look at this chart objectively relative to origins, i.e. the clue here is Uranus and Libra. He will have an intrinsic knowledge of the nature of vibration equaling creation. And the interfacing of vibratory rates, being responsible for a variety of different manifestations we call creation at an ideational level. It's a knowledge intrinsic to the soul. And his frustration, being in a human form, is trying to figure out the actual structural form through which to project this knowledge. And which would ultimately have a benefit for the entire species. That will be the essence of it. Would you say that's true? Absolutely. Okay. And then we step it down from there, i.e. different functions. But that's going to be the ultimate issue. And so that would be a truth, not just for Greg at a soul level, but the souls that are like him, i.e. emanating from the same star system, which is going to be part of what his underlying search is for his original tribe, but that part of the tribe that's on the earth. And that becoming the core of friendship formation, of like mind. And then by joining forces, 11th house, trying to put together a small collective group mind that has this underlying intrinsic knowledge. And then on a small group basis, trying to determine form. That's what the root issue is here.
There's also issues around trusting himself with the knowledge because he's got Jupiter on the moon. He's obviously got a very strong intuition. But with it being in Scorpio on the ascendant, it's learning to trust himself with what comes through. Like, is that really my imagination? Or
to experience it and validate it first.
Right. Proof. You need proof for what just came through.
But see, that's a particularly human phenomenon.
Well, he's here.
True, but it's also going to conflict with the element of a sense.
It can also be true that he has to totally do his own new thing, not related to anything than anybody else is to create a new.
You mean all by himself in a vacuum?
Not necessarily by himself, but like,
Something unique.
like not to do Reiki or some existing thing,
I think it
but
could be technology.
to,
Definitely through technology.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
systems,
Yeah.
it's the system thing.
Right.
but that it's gonna be new, it's not gonna be part of,
It's going to be new old. What's going to happen, as an example, even from prior lives on Earth, if we look at Uranus and Libra, there's going to be a whole connection to a time frame in ancient Rome and Greece that was directly linked with music of the spheres, because this in the end is vibration. So he's also going to have an intrinsic knowledge of music and the vibratory nature of music, and how music on a vibrational level is connecting to the vibrational nature of the human organism via chakras, via what's emanating from the brain as a reflection of the chakras. And like the radionics machines, trying to figure out various vibratory rates that affect consciousness, which of itself generates realization or perception of something. This is all going to be part of it, is it not true?
So sound healing maybe, or
Hmm?
kind of sound healing, or?
I mean, I work for a sound reinforcement company right now, and we use all kinds of things to predict sound energy, so I know there's something to it I haven't found it yet.
And color, do you work with color too? Do you work with color?
All of the predictions are.
Yeah.
But, you know, last night we were talking at dinner, and of course Greg announced himself as the whale. He's this record keeper who keeps many folders and files on his computer, and he has 3 computer systems. And of course, we're interested in refining these DVDs for the students' uses, and he's got all these great ideas on how to detail and highlight that, which is indicated in the chart. You know, so you can just see that he's coming into. I think he is finding. He is finding his right work in many ways.
The way to take the image, make it the vibration of form of image. Yeah.
Just self-actualization. It's exciting.
It is exciting. Can we take you home in our suitcase?
Do all Pluto in South Node or nodal axis in the 11th house, are they all like from outer space?
No,
I mean,
not at all. Not at all. You're dealing with, maybe if you look at it from the point of view of Earth and you saw a similar pattern, this pattern would apply to, relative to this type of soul on Earth. You're looking at maybe less than 1%. And so you could even, when you get adept at doing this sort of work, you can even determine at what point in human history, keeping in mind where the soul originates from, that it was actually put on Earth. And who would just want to make a, let's say, a guess if it's all right in there? Atlantis.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's in contact with Atlantis and technology.
And actually people on Atlantis, despite Christian or historical revisionism, had an exquisite knowledge of the interface between matter and antimatter, and the gravity within that, the push-pull. And so you could see how that would fit quite well with where he would originally land on Earth. Now, given the fact that he is in a human cage, we're also going to have to deal with human issues. So, from that from that point of view, we're kind of remembering the origins now because we've geared our interpretation to where it comes from. So now we have to step it down and deal specifically with human issues. And because where Greg comes from, the star of origin is not an emotional place. It's devoid of emotion.
But he can travel on energy waves outside of this cage?
Well, that's not, yes, of course, but the specific point right now, let's deal with putting this sort of soul in human cage. Human cage has emotion. So that's going to be the first shock to the soul. What's this stuff?
I did unplug.
I mean, it's its own shock.
We
You
got
know?
them with the Scorpio moon and it's.
We'll make it really for sure. It's like Scorpio emotions. Steve.
I feel like asking Greg what was like, or what his, briefly, what his childhood was like.
Yes, I'm printing up too.
Oh, that's fine.
Your mom and dad as well.
My grandfather and my family all came over from Latvia, and he was a Latvian mathematician, headmaster, mystic, spoke 7 languages. And, taught yoga here. He was yoga from my grandfather. So he had one. My father's family was Catholic. They baptized me, the whole thing. I freaked out. The priest died the next day. I didn't do it. And my mother's side of the family had a lot of there's some fundamentalist Christians in that, and they attempted it, it early to condition, but I think from the beginning was absolutely radically Christian, rebellious throughout all of that. Did a lot of art and music and things like that.
And only sisters, right?
Yeah, only sisters, but I was only child till I was 12.
Did you go to a regular school?
I was kicked out of every regular school.
Wow.
Yeah, I went to independent study and did
What were
really
you
well
kicked out
there.
for though?
Just not obeying the authority, basically.
You didn't fit.
Yeah, I didn't fit, and it was just.
Bottom line.
The work that I do, most people think I'm a graduate. I didn't even finish high school, so. I ended up thinking of myself, so. I've been on my own since I was about 15.
What was your emotional relationship with your parents?
Good. I'm very close. My mother did my first chart for me when I was like 16. Father, emotional, probably not so much.
Can you imagine Greg going to a normal astrologer?
I know.
Oh my. So let's come down and deal with Greg as a human now, and he shared some of his life and so forth. And what kind of emotional nature are we going to see in Greg? If you look at the nature of the emotional body here, what are you looking at?
Well, you pointed out the anger before.
I'm very sweet and sensitive.
That would be more.
Yeah. Right.
But there is the anger at the stupidity.
And what kind of emotions are these?
Betrayal, deep.
Very intense.
Is that not the most intense type of human emotion you can have? Scorpio.
Yes.
So, given that it's orientated to what kind of, is it not an emotional psychology, it's orientated to why? And now from the point of view of his origins, don't you see the obvious reason to understand how human emotional psychology in general Jupiter works? And without that kind of generalized knowledge of the human species, without that knowledge, then the ultimate purpose for why he is here cannot occur. So now you've got a double level. On the one hand, you've got the level of why he's here and connected to the soul origin, which is his own kind of transcendent knowledge. And then he's got the fact that he is in human cage with Scorpio emotions. You see it?
That's really the only way he can do the alchemy, learn to gold in a sense.
I'm sorry?
The only way he can kind of do the alchemy is to know exactly what the human emotion is, so
Right.
he would know how to transfer.
How can you help it unless you know it? Maybe another way to approach this too, Greg, is you can look at this group as an EA group, and then you could, if you wish, ask whatever questions the EA group and see if they can answer them for you through an EA chart. Scorpio moon goes, eek!
Also with the moon on the ascendant though, it's like that 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you know, kind of sense of, you know, trusting yourself again.
Yeah.
It's like you go forward and then you go back. It's like a stop-start scenario. Does that have happened
Occasionally, occasionally.
before?
I also feel that fundamentally due to the North Node in the Pisces in the 5th house, that one thing that he's learning here that he wouldn't get in his own history, in his own race, is the sense of human love. And that's a real healing thing for him to open up to human love.
Yeah, well, I have, and I have a lot of that too. It's just finding the person, because it's so rare, like you think, that it just don't connect.
Do you feel like you have more love than anyone's capable of returning?
That's typical of Scorpio.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that can also be a kind of way of holding back, too.
Well, I'm totally holding back, that's why I still can't.
Yeah, but
approach
I think
someone
it's such a healing thing, though. That,
Oh, I know, I'm aware of it.
Kim?
With the ruler of the South Node being in a T-square with this Scorpio moon, Saturn and Taurus, first 7th, there's a need for him to actually just keep participating in relationships and to keep walking through the emotional experiences. There's a tendency sometimes to just want to withdraw. I'll just be by myself, or I'll set my Saturn and Taurus certain thing up the way I want it. And by just keeping going and participating in relationships, then you can learn to
The problem
access
is there
all
are no
that
relationships.
Yeah.
I'm very self-sufficient, I have that whole deal going, but the core desire, the alienation, is to have relationships. I could have one in a second if it was there, but they just don't exist.
Yeah, but now-
Human relationships, just friends and coworkers.
But no, his origin issues, that's why an intimate thing can be very, very difficult, because you've reduced the possibilities for a soul like that in terms of all the women on earth. You've reduced the actual possibilities to him to about 1.5%. But see, there's a related function of relationship. And that's one of the meanings of Neptune squaring the nodes, is to produce children that emanate from the same solar system.
He's right.
Going to be a breeding factory.
Is anyone in this room from his stars?
And isn't it true that your daughter has a very unique intelligence?
Soul I've actually connected with more than any other.
There you go.
Wow.
She has a capacity beyond anyone I've ever known.
See, listen to the words. And that's actually one of the purposes. North Node and 5th, children.
And I found out about her when Uranus hit my 5th house cusp.
There you go. The operational planet, Uranus, yeah. See how this stuff goes together? If you know where something's actually coming from, it's like magic at that point, isn't it? Is there any observations you guys see in the chart that you want to check out with Greg? Any astrological signatures, something you want to run past him? It's a great way to learn astrology.
Well, just observing the ruler of Taurus is Venus, and he has such a nice Venus in Pisces. I just see that as kind of, really kind of romantic and inside, really, really open, and that coupled with the moon Jupiter.
Yeah, my experience has been when I am very open like that, and I typically am, then I get the betrayal for the abandonment. That typically happens.
Let's see what happens here in times that we live like this, frankly. Because that Venus and Piscean overlay and Uranus standing there in the 12th, on an emotional level, creates a fundamental emotional purity that's intrinsically innocent,
Yeah.
devoid of ulterior agenda and all this crap. There's a natural inner union between the male and the female. And there's a direct pipeline to God, which generates the purity. And in times like this, especially when you run it through this moon Neptune, or the moon Jupiter business, attracting women that have duplicity, double agendas, use-orientated, say whatever they need to say to hook. Once the hook is in place, guess what? That's the femme fatale.
Not always a moon Jupiter, but because it's a Scorpio, right?
And that becomes one of the greatest experiences of Piscean disillusionment. So then we ask the question, and we have to ask it as EA astrologers. First, what is the intent of great interfacing with such a creature? And then second, is there a way to change it? Because again, one of the underlying functions is to produce at least a couple kids that originate from the same solar system. So the first question is, why contract this sort of female type in the first place? What would be the answer? Vernon?
So we can learn discrimination.
I'm sorry?
So we can learn discrimination.
Okay, that's one obvious reason.
I think part of it's been his ongoing experiment with understanding human emotions and motives.
Mm-hmm.
And then by recognizing the motives, and I think because of the intrinsic naivete, that there has to be an awareness that he has to come to of just saying, this is reality. You know, this is the reality of how some people operate. And then in building that in his consciousness, then he's able to not compulsively go into that, subconsciously go into that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Stephen?
That's basically what I was going to say.
That's all correct, but there's an underlying issue here, and the underlying issue, you have a compensation principle here. Yes, Jupiter? And so what you can see is that in prior lifetimes, because he has been emotionally betrayed so much in other cultures, that there's a compensation for it in the last few centuries. And the compensation is what? Now being instinctually attracted to women who are in some degree of problem or crisis, or in some degree of emotional, psychological difficulty, in which the compensatory role manifests as I'll be the counselor or the psychologist or the helper or the teacher for you. This is the unconscious trying to guarantee a sense of security, Scorpio, based on the position. If they need me, therefore. But that's exactly the dynamic that attracts the duplicity.
That's exactly the thing I've been avoiding completely.
Good. You got it. But that's the operate.
Relationship unless it's equal. I don't want
Yes.
to be therapist or their counselor.
That's right.
It doesn't work.
Do you see it? So now what are we describing? We're describing that in the end, the only way a relationship's going to work is with a woman who's already healed, not needing healing, has already looked into herself psychoanalytically, understands how and why she's put together, Saturn in the 7th, most importantly, owns it. So then the relationship is based on a mutual Saturn and Taurus, a mutual self-reliance, in which the attitude, Moon, Neptune, the Moon, Jupiter in the first, the mutual attitude will be, we're with each other simply because we want to be, not because we need to be. Do you see that critical shift? So, any other things you want to check out with Greg? Any questions you have, Greg?
I'm a little interested in knowing more about specific specific details in past life that might have led to this situation about like specific types of betrayals and abandonments, these types of things, these different symbols of persecution, just, I don't know, any kind of other details that might be through these south nodes and planetary nodes that kind of led to this.
Details such as?
He wants the story.
He wants the story.
But he's too afraid to ask.
His story.
Kim?
This is just a little note to Greg that I recently went to a Barbara Brennan energy worker, and I think she's from the star system, and that and she works and she teaches it out there in Florida actually, and that they work with NASA, like the astronauts when they come back and stuff. And anyway, that she may know some people.
Kim's gonna hook you up.
Where do you live?
Alameda.
Oh, that's right.
As you say, the happy little astrology books that some of us have read. I'm just a rank amateur, and I look at the chart from that point of view, just a snapshot. And I mean, there's just several things that I would see from that point of view, not speaking directly about the soul, but I mean, I see highly creative person, emotionally self-sufficient, get things done. The Saturn opposing ascendant, I'm not, and the moon, I'm not quite sure how to phrase it quickly. Then you start bringing in these ideas of emotional betrayal with Jupiter conjunct the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Boom. My happy little astrology books out the window.
That should be an indication William should make a nice big bonfire.
So it's not, it's such, it's one, actually, one point out of many. But let's just take that one.
Yeah.
Jupiter and moon opposed to ascendant, I get a good feeling when I see that.
Well, look at him, he's always smiling.
Yeah.
He projects that.
Oh, yeah. You just hang out with him, you can feel all of it.
And he's read happy little astrology books too. You said Jupiter, moon, betrayal in relationship. I have nowhere to place that.
Yeah, I thought it was Neptune.
Scorpio.
Betrayal
Well, it's
was
the
Neptune.
Scorpio.
Betrayal as an archetype is Scorpio. Violations of trust as an archetype is Scorpio. As a result, you have the linkage to loss, feeling abandonment. These are Scorpio archetypes. And the reason is that you have the issue of use in Scorpio. The reason you have use is that you have the underlying archetype of Scorpio by its very nature in which we are asked through the archetype to combine forces with another, which is why it's called marriage. To put all this stuff together in a patriarchal reality, the underpinning of which in consciousness is self-interest and exclusion. So in a patriarchal reality, Scorpio becomes these things at a negative emotional orientation. In a natural reality, we wouldn't have these things.
One of the themes that I see for the betrayal is partner that you have had becomes attracted to your friend. And the thing when I look at the 11th house and all this, the Scorpio combination, has there been anyone in this life where you've had a partner that's either been with one of your friends or attracted or?
I've had one that has done that, but it was after it was already. Probably the most intense was just recently at the, probably the first EA conference. I met someone there who I had an 8th house composite Pluto with. So it was instinct, instinctuous everywhere. We saw each other everywhere, so she started living with me. It was like instinct sort of thing. But then she used me for all the knowledge, learning how to use computers and all this sort of stuff. And then 6 months to the day practically came home and everything was gone. So that type of thing.
Would he have been one of the people who seeded the knowledge from Atlantis into Egypt?
Say it one more time.
Would he have been one of the people who seeded
Yes.
the knowledge from Atlantis into Egypt?
Right. In fact, he would have been a survivor at Atlantis
Right.
because
Which is why I was drawn
Yeah.
to Yonaguni in Japan, where I just went through that.
Yeah.
there you go.
Water. I don't think it was Atlantis.
No, it wasn't. Similar.
Feeling there.
See, when Atlantis was destroyed, there was a certain survival percentage, and the actual means of survival, by the way, were porpoises and dolphins. They took the humans that were floating out in the ocean, they just hung onto the fin, and they were then taken originally to what's now called Egypt. That's why there's such a link between original Atlantis and original Egypt.
But then could he also have been, after being one of those seed people, also experienced that level of disillusionment that I was talking about, the betrayal of how humans have misused, that he came back at other times when from its golden age and really did the degenerative use
Right.
of magic, etc., and experienced that
Right.
there also.
Yes, of course. Okay. So you wanted more little stories, did you?
Yeah, they're beautiful. What are your blessings?
Paul?
Well, just from, I've already talked to Greg Sumsa about his issue with his daughter and their connection through many lives, but kind of seeing that in the chart is the Mercury in the 4th house, and that rules the south node. And they were probably siblings in this other tribe, in this other galaxy or whatever, and coming into this life, they've had each other, or through many lives, they've had each other as a source of strength and drawing upon each other. So there's a natural connection with this individual, and it's in conjunct the south node. So they used each other or drew upon each other to protect themselves or to survive the society and the groups that they were born into.
Absolutely accurate. As two souls in essence have made a pact. Like a American Indian blood brother pact. To help each other through eternity.
Our Plutos actually land on each other's ascendants as well.
Well, there you go. Because you're absolutely accurate. And it's taking place in that context at times as siblings. And in moments of siblings, even intimacy. So. Any other observations you want to check out? So you guys getting a, is this working for you in terms of just kind of doing these exercises? And, I mean, you can see it's a classic example that the more you do, the more practicing, the more charts, just in trying to work with these paradigms, it's pretty soon it's like anything else, you're going to get used to it. Just a matter of adjusting your focus. It's like putting on a new set of glasses. That's all it is. It's just a matter of letting the eye get retrained to the new focus. It's okay. Well, we're going to do one more chart then, and because of the chart we're going to do is Lee, and because Lee's been a great rickshaw driver since we've been here, and so what we're going to do is take a